Okay, hello and welcome to ESMARConf 2023 and to our panel discussion, how do we scale evidence synthesis, education and capacity building? This session is being live streamed to YouTube and automatic subtitles should be available shortly after the event, and we'll work hard to get these manually verified as soon as possible. If you have any questions for our panel, you can ask them via the ES Hackathon Twitter account by commenting on the tweet about this session. And if you registered for the conference, you can also comment and chat with other participants on our dedicated Slack channel. We'll endeavour to answer all questions as soon as possible. We'd like to take time to draw your attention to our code of conduct available on the ESMARConf website at www.esmaconf.org. Our panel consists of Wolfgang Viechtbauer from Maastricht University, Sarah Young from Carnegie Mellon, and Marc Lajeunesse from University of South Florida. My name's Pritchard, I'm from Nottingham Trent University, and I'm going to be moderating the session today. I suppose we can get started with a nice warm-up question of to the panel of what barriers have you faced when trying to teach about evidence synthesis methods?
Anybody want to take this one? Otherwise, I guess I could share some of my thoughts. Well, one of the difficult things with evidence synthesis is, in my opinion, that it spans so many different methods and techniques, right? So if we teach regression modeling, okay, that's a big can of worms in itself, but that's somewhat still contained. But when it comes to meta-analysis or evidence synthesis more broadly, there's so many approaches, techniques that we use, and you basically cover an entire stats curriculum once you start delving into these methods. And so I think this is one of the big challenges, that also people do need a somewhat decent understanding of basic statistics, right? So, I mean, that's sort of, you cannot really easily delve into evidence synthesis methods unless you're already somewhat comfortable with regression modeling. And well, it touches basically also on multi-level modeling, because typically these days you have much more complicated data sets. So you get into dependency issues. Suddenly you are knee deep into multivariate methods, multi-level models. So it's just, you open up such a wide diversity of techniques. And yeah, I think that's one of the major challenges and barriers that, yeah, in my opinion, at least.
Sarah?
Sure. Yeah, I would. So I'm going to be, I think a lot of my experience is coming from teaching information specialists and librarians with evidence synthesis methods. So the folks that are supporting researchers in doing this kind of work. And we've developed a course that we teach a couple times a year. And I think our main problem, and I think this is something we'll be talking about more in this panel, is scaling. So there's a huge need and a huge interest in these skills, and just even within the library and information specialist community. And we only have so many instructors, so much bandwidth ourselves to teach these courses. So we end up having many folks register for our training. We can only take on about 50 participants per course, but we know there's a huge need out there. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that we've faced is just how do we reach more people, with a high quality and kind of rigorous training program. But I think that's something we'll probably address a bit more in later questions.
Marc, did you have anything?
Yes. I agree with everything that's been said already. And some of the impressions I get after the courses that I teach is that they're very thankful that they have a better understanding of the process of how to do a synthesis. But once they actually get to starting a project, it's the reading and extracting is the biggest challenge. And that's not anything we could train, because every study is very idiosyncratic in what it's reported. And so you're kind of left really having to solve a problem with every single study to extract what you need. And like Wolfgang said, you know, you really have to be like a historian of statistics, because you're reading old papers that are using antiquated methods along with like recent papers that are using fancy mixed models. How do you pull effect sizes from a mixed model to like someone that uses a bootstrapped ANOVA or something like that? And so, but those are what I always feel like are epically giant gaps in training, is these minutia of information that you can only really accrue by doing it and getting experience in reading all this stuff.
Actually, if I may follow this up, so one of the biggest challenges, I totally agree, is actually the extraction of the effect sizes, and often there isn't like a perfect, easy solution, right? So you have to sort of sometimes figure out, is what I'm doing good enough, right? Is it sort of kind of defensible? I know, well, in this case, for just to give an example, right? We can take a t statistic from an independent samples t-test and convert it into a standardized mean difference. But what if it's not a student's t-test, but a Welch's t-test? Strictly speaking, that conversion formula doesn't apply then. It's not anymore correct. So, right, at that point, you have to make a decision. First of all, you need to even be aware of these kind of intricacies, right? That's one issue. But even if you are aware of this, then you have to make a decision. What do you do here, right? Do you just say, well, I cannot include that study? So you're throwing a whole study away if you cannot reach the authors. That's always an attempt, worth an attempt, but yeah, that doesn't always work out. So then you have to make these decisions, and they're incredibly hard, and there aren't easy solutions here. And so it's a combination of like experience, having sort of an understanding of robustness of certain methods, and this is not something you pick up a book and they will tell you. Like, this stuff isn't written down often. So that's really a major challenge, right? So the cases that we teach often are the straightforward, easy cases where you avoid all these intricacies. Well, you have to start somewhere, but then people get into a real meta-analysis or evidence synthesis project, and suddenly they are faced with real life, which is 10 times more difficult than all these nice examples that we dig up for our teaching. So yeah.
Excellent. Does anyone else want to come in on this question, or I can kind of move nicely on to the next one?
I was just going to make a comment on Wolfgang's comment, and just to the sense that sort of, starts getting us to this question of maybe a higher level of capacity building. So beyond training and thinking about, the organizational support, the methodological experts that people might have access to, when they get to doing their actual project, and needing some sort of, more than a textbook or more than the training that they had to turn to. And again, maybe we'll get more to that, but I think, thinking about the training and building that sort of access to the expertise is also an important piece of this.
Excellent. And I think we've heard a lot about a lot of the challenges in even just training sort of 20, 30 people at a time, and some of the challenges that you face in doing that. But, in order to build capacity, we have to sort of look at training entire generations of researchers. So what are your thoughts on how we train lots of people in these methods, particularly when they're not very widely understood or appreciated?
I think a lot of people do appreciate the methods, right? And that's probably why they're interested in jumping into it in the first place. But there's layers of training that need to happen before we could make use of their skills. And it's really difficult to have someone start a research synthesis project if if they haven't done any stats or they haven't done their own research project yet. And I interact with a lot of graduate students where their first official project is a synthesis project. And there's so many layers that they have to understand, like experimental design, just what is considered a high quality experimental design, or what is considered a observational experiment. How do you distinguish these things? What kind of evidence can you pull out of these types of studies? And so rather than spending time in like teaching synthesis tools like pooling and aggregating and all that stuff, you're really spending time catching people up, which is fine. I'm totally happy doing that stuff. But if you're teaching a cohort with mixed experience, really what you're doing is spending a lot of time teaching people that are behind.
Now we're back to the challenges again, right? Yeah. I mean, okay. So I think you have to phrase this maybe a bit more positively. You have to just make sure that you have people have sort of a decent exposure to the fundamentals, experimental design, as Marc just said. That's a real good one. So you have to make sure that people have that the basics are covered, and yeah, you cannot treat, I think, evidence synthesis as like, yeah, sort of a starting point. That is sort of the culmination of many different techniques that you learn along the way. And then once you start to master those, then I think the next step is to, well, if that's what you're interested in, is to consider something like a meta-analysis or research synthesis. But I don't think, as Marc also said, I don't think it should be like your first year PhD project. I've seen that many times, and that's usually not a good idea, in my opinion. I mean, it's often the advisor that says, well, you know, you're reading the papers anyway, so why don't you just do a meta-analysis? And yeah, that's often going to end in a lot of tears.
Excellent. Sarah, did you have anything?
I mean, not much to add, just to agree that, you know, in my experience in supporting researchers at a university and doing evidence synthesis, you know, we do get definitely, you know, graduate students who want to take something like this on for a dissertation lit review, or, you know, maybe just in preparation for a dissertation. And, you know, we often advise against, you know, trying to incorporate a systematic review into a dissertation, because it in and of itself is a, you know, potentially multi-year, multiple team member kind of project. And so yeah, just to agree with what Marc and Wolfgang were.
Then again, to avoid that this again sounds like too discouraging. I mean, on the other hand, if you are willing to take this on, I think you have to take it on with the right expectation, right? So be prepared that it's not going to be like a quick weekend project, right? That's unrealistic. And also probably not half a year. It might take longer. So, but if you are willing to take this on, you're building up skills that are extremely valuable. And at a certain point, you just have to dive in, right? I mean, you could say, well, no, this is too difficult. I'm going to push this off. I'm not going to dare to tackle this. But if you are willing to dive in and to work on meta-analysis, you are going to gain a deeper understanding of the literature. It's more so than if you were just reading the papers, because you really, really have to read between the lines. And so you're definitely going to get that. Plus, you are picking up extremely valuable skills along the way, right? In terms of understanding different designs, how you can evaluate this kind of evidence, how to search the literature, even going back before we get to the stats, right? How do you effectively search? There's so many skills that you will pick up along the way. So you could say, great, I mean, couldn't be better, right? But it's going to be tough going, right? Because there's so much to learn along the way. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, I want to avoid that people are completely discouraged here, because yeah, you could also phrase it as, well, this is like the most effective way to gain a very deep understanding of the whole research process.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen many examples of people taking on a research synthesis project and then going back to doing primary studies and just reminding themselves, I'm not going to be the one that's not going to report the sample size, right? I'm going to report all the information people need to make an assessment of the evidence that I'm presenting. And so that itself, I think, is a very valuable learning outcome by taking on one of these epic challenges of synthesizing research. Is you end up knowing how to report things, maybe useful for another synthesis person to come by and make use of your study, but also to add clarity to just primary research.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, just to agree with those statements, and to think, sort of gets me thinking too about, just maybe even starting with building some basic foundations and raising awareness of these methods, learning, teaching maybe undergraduate students how to read and evaluate a systematic review, I think is a step toward, capacity building and training of that next generation. I know Marc, I think you have some great examples of this too, of teaching undergraduates the evidence synthesis method and all of these skill sets that they can learn and apply to other research projects. I think there's been some successful examples of that. So yeah, lots of different sort of stepping blocks or stepping stones to that process.
Excellent. I think one of the things that was mentioned was about sort of supervisors sort of suggesting, or why don't you just go ahead and do a meta-analysis, and thinking it'll be a relatively easy first year project. But I guess there's something I picked up there about, could mentoring from evidence synthesis specialists for people who are really interested in taking on one of these projects be something that could be used to build that capacity?
I mean, I do with my graduate students. Like I don't hesitate if that's what they want to do as their first project. I'm okay, but they have direct access to me, and I understand all the challenges already that they're going to be confronted with. So I could easily provide solutions, or training modules, or maybe some neat resources that are freely available out there to help them move things along. But other mentors may not have such detailed understanding of the discipline, and so the training should also be at that level also, right? We're training at the undergrad level, but profs also need to catch up on things.
I was just thinking that so I mean, people are going to be doing evidence synthesis in some form anyway, right? I mean, the moment you sit down and you read 5 papers on a particular topic, treatment, whatever, you're already starting to do evidence synthesis in your head, right? I mean, we're doing this constantly. So I think just raising a bit of the awareness how this is happening anywhere, in any point in when you're doing research, you're always doing evidence synthesis. Whether you're doing it formally or informally, that's a separate issue. But I think once people start to realize this, then it's like everybody should scream like, please train me more on the more formal methods, right? Because it's the fundamental thing that we actually end up doing in science, right? You do, of course, your own study, but you always write an introduction where you try to embed your own research in the context of what was done before. Are you doing this informally? Yeah, typically, but you could also think about, okay, well, I should maybe do a little bit of a more systematic search. It doesn't have to turn into a meta-analysis in the end that you publish as a meta-analysis, but at least you are sort of more aware of, well, I shouldn't be just picking these 5 studies because they support where I'm going with my own research, right? So I should really be a bit more neutral and search the literature and see really what comes up when I do it a bit more comprehensively and not so, well, selectively. So in a way, I think, yeah, once you understand how important it is, I think it should be, you could also turn it around and say, well, the entire curriculum should be based on just training people to do evidence synthesis. But maybe I'm a bit too enthusiastic about it, so I don't know.
I see that when students are pulling together a thesis proposal, right? You're trying to figure out how you fit into this research domain. You indirectly synthesize a lot of information to see how you could squeeze in. Sure, there's heavily emphasis on novelty, but your supervisor might point you in a direction where they've accrued a lot of experience on what is a good experimental design, what's not an adequate experimental design. All of these things emerge through reading a ton of stuff and being able to evaluate the quality. And then, you know, because you're so familiar with it, your brain automatically synthesizes and provides the aggregate effect. And so I see it all the time, but again, you're right. The philosophy isn't that, you know, we're applying research systematically, research synthesis in a systematic way. It's more like I need to pull together an introduction describing this domain. Approaching it systematically is probably maybe the easiest way to actually get to that, because at least you have some rules to follow.
I suppose just sort of picking up on that, I mean, there's a chance that some people may well know about sort of some of these good systematic approaches and these methods. So how do we encourage people to actually use them in sort of their writings and their research?
I think people are definitely willing to use them because you realize that the impact that systematic reviews and meta-analyses can have on the field, right? So I think that is one of the appeals that you have. I mean, that sounds maybe a bit not the right motivation, but okay, in the end, you end up maybe getting an article in a high impact journal, right? So, and that is attractive, right? I mean, that is definitely something good for your own academic career. That's how it is, right? So that in itself definitely motivates people to learn, or I think encourages people to learn some of these techniques and then also to attempt an evidence synthesis. So I think the understanding of the importance of these methods is out there, I would say, because people read meta-analyses all the time, right? I mean, it's usually the first thing that you probably try to find when you are getting into a new topic, right? You're not going to start reading the 50 individual studies. Let's see if there's a meta-analysis, right? So And then, well, being a good consumer of that meta-analysis is maybe even the first step, right? And then you might get encouraged to maybe attempt something yourself, like this yourself.
Any other people want to come in on that, or shall I go to the next question? Okay, I suppose I'll go for the next question. So, in terms of recent developments towards building capacity in delivering of evidence synthesis, what would you say is like the biggest recent development that's impacted on you building capacity within your organisation or elsewhere?
You mean besides ESMARConf, right?
Well, we were fishing for that answer, but
okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I don't think it's a joke, right? I mean, I think this is definitely one of these developments that that is leading to generally helping people get more into these methods and building skills. And I think this goes along with just generally more openness in the sciences, right? I mean, we have open science, but what goes along with that, right? So open materials, open tools. And I think there's this explosion of software and R packages, and I think that's the biggest development over the last 10, 15 years, I would say. I mean, before that, people were still doing their meta-analyses, often using spreadsheets that they would put together. And yeah, well, that's probably not the best approach. And yeah, we are seeing just an incredible explosion of tools that we're hearing about as part also of this conference, right? So I think that is the biggest development, in my opinion. Just, yeah, tools and openness in terms of sharing materials, making things accessible, like during this conference.
Well, I think like the stuff that Wolfgang does with the live streaming, all that stuff is like, you couldn't get that stuff 10 years ago, right? There's no way, no resource on the internet where you could like sign up for something and be a participant and have direct access to ask questions in a visual way, right? Maybe you had like a handbook, a dusty handbook that a supervisor gave you, and that was your entire exposure to the synthesis. But if you want now, right, you could sit in with Wolfgang and he'll teach you some cool stuff. I think that's been an innovation too, because the reach is incredible. Anyone in the world could sit in on this, right? If I teach a lecture at the university, it's closed, right? 5 graduate students, 4 of which aren't really perhaps interested in research synthesis. They have to take the course because it's part of their degree requirement. But everyone, if you seek this stuff out, you know, you could find people to sit at Twitch and watch, learn things from that. I think that is, you know, if you could push things to the visual medium, I mean, as opposed to text, the possibilities are endless in terms of training.
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen that. Again, with the training that we do for information specialists, that originally was planned to be an in-person, twice a year gathering of, you know, 20 folks that we could support with our grant funding. And we were forced to switch to a virtual training, which turned out to be really successful. And so we just have done all of those trainings virtually. We were able to train like twice as many people per training as we expected. And, you know, and I think folks are just now more used to the Zoom environment and learning in an online environment. So I think that really does help, especially with the, you know, the sort of more live, training opportunities. It really opens the door for anyone to join, from basically anywhere. So that's been really exciting. And even also just the, building sort of online course materials and making those available for asynchronous learning. There's really great examples of that now. And a lot of good evidence that kind of learning can be really successful. So I think, to me, that's been one of the biggest sort of advantages of the recent few years.
Yeah, and I think I'm just sort of reflecting on the effort it would have taken to get you three together in a room prior to these developments. Would have been something. So yeah, that I think certainly the reach of these sort of online courses and conferences is phenomenal. I mean, I know that last year we had participants from across the world, and it was really cool to see. So yeah, it's nice that sort of in your world it's also making that impact. And I suppose that leads me nicely on to, if you've got somebody who perhaps is in an institution where there isn't much capacity to deliver evidence synthesis, but they want to build that capacity, what would you say to them?
So I think a selling point here is open science. So I often view meta-analysis actually as part of open science. I don't know, for some reason, for me, these things are like completely intertwined. And I'm not sure if I could formulate exactly why I see it this way, but to me, right, I mean, if you are synthesizing evidence, right, this is what we are doing, and then you want this process also to be part of the whole open science process. The ideal is, of course, a meta-analysis of registered reports, right? So, but the moment you get into these methods, you are immediately faced with these concepts coming from open science. At least that's how I sort of think about this. And I think there is this increased appreciation for the importance of open science, and I see this happening at my own university, and so I think that is I don't know exactly yet how I would sort of package that, but I think this would be kind of maybe a good way to sell how important evidence synthesis is, because, well, if you embed it in terms of these open science practices, I think then there's immediately more interest for this, because, there's just generally more appreciation for the importance of open science. So that would be kind of my strategy, I would say.
Yeah, open science is one of these indirect high quality learning outcomes when you take on a research synthesis project. And like one of the exercises I like to do with my students is, on campus, try to find PDFs but also do it off campus when you don't have institutional access to the library, and see how many PDFs you can recover, right? And in the end, when we come back and we discuss these issues, they're like, holy smokes. Like, what do people do when they want to aggregate a whole bunch of studies and they don't have access to it? I'm like, well, I don't have an answer to that, but you get the point that it could be incredibly challenging. And so like Wolfgang said, it's all intertwined at every level. And so, yeah, that should be like one of these door stoppers to get people in, is just understanding the importance of having free access or open access to information.
Yeah, that's such an interesting observation, Wolfgang. I always am looking for that intersection between open science and evidence synthesis as a librarian who works in a library where we have both an evidence synthesis service and a pretty robust open science program. I think libraries are actually a really central, they play a really central role in this sort of ecosystem. And if I think about, an institution that's looking to build capacity, maybe looking toward their library as a place to start in terms of building up, expertise and information retrieval and searching methods, building, open access and open science, platforms and services and systems. I think, the library can be really pivotal in supporting this kind of work in both of those kinds of directions.
Definitely. This is probably a good time to remind people that can post any questions you've got on Slack, on Twitter, or actually comment on the YouTube video as well. So if any of you have any questions for our panelists, more than happy to kind of put the questions to the panelists, I guess. So yeah, excellent, and thank you for those comments. I suppose you've talked about this a little bit about how you're able to sort of scale your cohort sizes of the online delivery, but I suppose what techniques have you used to share your knowledge about evidence synthesis with larger groups of people, sort of maybe sort of 50 plus 100 people maybe?
Well, I mean, it was already mentioned that that's the one thing that I do through these Twitch streams, right? So, and also just having moved my courses online. Before I used to teach a meta-analysis course in Maastricht, and then you only have people coming who are either nearby or who have the money to travel and so it just, that's so in retrospective so incredibly restricting in terms of access, and moving these courses online, I can lower the cost to something that is much more affordable for a much broader audience, and you immediately see that happening. So I think, yeah, so that's what I do. I love teaching through this sort of online format. Of course, it's nice when you're sitting together in a room and there's this atmosphere of we are in this together and we are learning. That's great. It's just, but then if that's what you do, it just means you exclude like 95% of people, right? So that's the trade-off, and I think, yeah, that's too big of a trade-off, in my opinion.
And you really want to maximize your time, right? You're spending a lot of time educating people. Why not make it open to as many as you can? Which I think facilitates the whole thing. I try to do it with my undergraduate students. I have 250 right now, and some of the first things I talk about is research synthesis outcomes. Just because once in a while, science comes their way, and they need a way to kind of interpret and understand, like, what's the magnitude of this finding. And when I describe them that there's a whole process, a whole system out there that is devised to aggregate and reach a consensus, they're like, oh, okay, so there's more to it than just the one study that made a proclamation, that it's often belongs to a constellation of studies with various outcomes, and that there's people out there thinking about that structure, not just the one study.
Yeah, just to build on that same, I think we've already mentioned the move to virtual trainings and the building of online content. I think I could mention here the Campbell collaboration just released a course on systematic review and meta-analysis, which for Campbell reviews, but really applies widely to reviews in the social sciences. And it's built on an open learning initiative platform, which was developed here at Carnegie Mellon, based on learning science. And learning science principles. So it's a really robust course. Definitely encourage folks to check that out. We're looking for feedback on that course now. So, hopefully we'll see more and more of these sorts of things and opportunities over time. But, I will say that was a very much a team effort over a very, very long period of time. So building this content sometimes can be, a pretty significant time and resource investment. But again, I think we're seeing more of this sort of thing available, which is great.
I think one of the potential barriers is also that you are offering content for free, right? And then you have people higher up the chain who sort of question this, right? So like, can we not sort of monetize this, or right? So what do you mean you're providing these materials completely for free to people out there, right? So I think there is a change of thinking that goes along again with open science, the open science movement, but that still will take time, right? That that materials should be open and accessible and not locked behind paywalls. And I have to, of course, some of the teachers some of the courses that I teach are not free. I mean, I do also have a course fee for some of my courses. So you could question that. I mean, if you want to be, really picky, or maybe, I don't know. I mean, but then again, I do provide also a lot of free and open teaching, right? That I think that compensates a little bit for that. So, I actually even think about this quite a bit. Why not just make it all open and freely accessible? And I don't know. It's something that I think about at times. Yes.
Yeah, and I think for the course, this Campbell course, those conversations are happening, and it's currently free. And I think, the reality is that it's not actually free to host this content. There's someone who's paying for something. So, we're looking at models where we might offer sort of a certificate level version of the course for some fee, and then an open and free version of the course, that's not attached to a certificate. So that's one potential way to address that.
And I think that brings me relatively nicely onto the question about using like MOOCs, the massively open online courses, and that seems to be what the Campbell course is all about. But that has its own challenges, doesn't it? It isn't free to host these things, and Sarah's talked a bit about the challenges around that. But I guess just and Wolfgang a bit, but did anyone else have any thoughts about the use of MOOCs to kind of deliver training on undertaking sort of evidence synthesis?
So I think a MOOC in itself still, to some extent, requires that you provide support somewhere, right? That there's some forum, or even maybe some opportunity for live interaction. Right, so a MOOC that is just purely thrown online without any opportunity for people to ask questions, or even just to interact with each other, right? So I think that's okay. I mean, you are providing it for free, right? But still, I think in an ideal setting, there should be some kind of forum interaction possibility. And so, then that requires people's time and commitment. And so, well, where is that coming from, right? So, and who is supporting that? So then you do get into these questions about, well, should we charge for this, even if it's a minimal fee, or maybe for people who want a certificate at least. So I mean, it's great, of course, when people provide things for free, like completely for free, but it's not free entirely, even for the person, right? The person who spends their time writing these materials, teaching openly, freely, right? Somewhere there's a price to be paid, right? I mean, sometimes my wife asks me, like, what are you doing on these Thursday evenings when you are sitting there for like 7 hours blabbing away? And I have to say she's extremely supportive of it, but she just wonders sometimes, like, why are you doing this, right? So I don't have a good answer for that.
Yes, yeah, so some of the MOOCs that I've seen, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. It's a very passive learning approach. People are just watching. It's like a fisheye lens in a classroom. And so they're not really applying a lot of best practices in terms of education. You know, being active, prompts, trying to catch people's attention, not taking it as far as doing like flipped classroom stuff or approaches to try to get people to learn learning outcomes in a different way. But like, what else are you supposed to do if you have 1,000 or so plus participants? You kind of have to adopt these broad dissemination practices. And so, yeah, so my advice is a lot of these big things, again, they're not fully optimized in terms of efficient learning. And then maybe that's a potential future avenue, is adopting a lot of these best practice education approaches to enhance what people walk away from the course, rather than just passive information.
I think we can also maybe think about other like models. I often think about the carpentries, for example, where you're basically building free curriculum that anyone can take and, you know, teach in a live, you know, synchronous learning environment. So kind of a combination in the sense that it's, you know, the curriculum's out there and you have this whole world full of potential instructors to sort of take it forward and teach it. I don't know, that's not quite, obviously not a MOOC, but sort of just a different way of thinking about extending.
It gives that opportunity, doesn't it, to kind of put forward more of those sort of active learning techniques and things like that than you could get from your typical MOOC. So perhaps that is something that may well be a more effective way of actually you know, delivering training and education in these methods than just having a sort of more passive online platform without any of that, or without as much of that facilitation.
Yeah, and I think, oh, go ahead, Marc.
Oh, all I wanted to say is I think one of the successes with the carpentry stuff is they're very consistent in the messaging. Right, everyone who teaches is trained the same way, and everyone is describing the same material. I think that consistency is helpful if you're trying to train a broad pool of people.
So we had a sort of, it's not really a question, but I guess a comment from on YouTube about evidence synthesis being part of the research methodology curriculum in universities. I'm thinking that sort of applies to undergraduate level, and I suppose just I know we've mentioned it a little bit, but just putting that out there as a comment. What do you think to evidence synthesis methods being a key part of sort of research methods curriculums at undergrad level?
I think this would be great, because like we said at the beginning, right, it spans so much of what people are learning anyway. And I think it's right? We show these evidence pyramids, right? And okay, you can debate this, but right, it's somewhere at the top there, right? For better or for worse. And it's and even if you don't think about it in terms of quality of evidence, you can think about it as part of the whole process of what we do in the sciences. And so I think it's almost should be a requirement that people get some exposure to this, right? Coming back to just even these basic skills. How do you search the literature effectively? Right? What databases are out there? This is not stuff that I was taught. Definitely not at that. No, well, nowhere actually. I mean, this was just not part of the curricula that I followed. Right? So we learned how to calculate a t-test by hand, and you can question: wouldn't the time have been spent better on some of these other things? Right? So yeah.
Excellent. Any other comments on that? Sorry, Sarah, I think you wanted to say something.
No.
Excellent. Okay, I think we're coming up. We've only got sort of 9 minutes left, so I'll try and wrap it up with maybe 1 or 2 more questions. But one of the questions I was thinking about was about you know, if you do try and build evidence synthesis capacity within your institution, not everyone may be using best practices or maybe is up to date as others. So how do you combat sort of poor evidence synthesis practices when trying to build capacity?
Do you just have to shame people into no? Yeah, that's tough. I mean, you have to pick up people where they are, right? You have to sort of develop sort of an understanding of what you can throw at people. And yeah, I mean, obviously don't you know, like directly confront people. That's just not a good strategy, in my opinion. I think if you just have to be patient. That's one thing I would say. Be patient. Don't immediately expect people to change their ways completely. We see the same thing again coming back to open science, right? Don't think people are immediately going to adapt every little piece of the whole open science idea, and one step at a time, right? I think that's how you should approach it, and yeah.
And I was just going to sort of comment that I think some of the responsibility for, you know, producing quality evidence synthesis does lie in the peer review process, and that sort of loops back also to open science, where maybe open peer review, you know, models might be a way of addressing some of the problems in the peer review of evidence synthesis. I mean, we see a lot of really bad systematic reviews published, and you know, there's got to be somewhere along that pipeline there's a problem, and you know, open peer review might allow for more, you know, people with real methods expertise and say systematic searching or the statistical side, you know, to get in there and comment on you know, on work that's being put out there.
Yeah, having teams be open to expert advice early in the phases of a project rather than late. It's not unusual for me to be presented a project, and then I see that like a lot of best practices were kind of skipped over, and they were like, fix this. I mean, I could have helped you out at the beginning of the project, and we could have avoided all of this mumbo jumbo. And so maybe training people to be more amenable to collaborations during the devising of the protocol or during the devising of the project, so that they could avoid issues downstream when it comes to pulling together a report that is nice. I feel like over and over again, I just get presented something that is incomplete. But a lot of the issues could have been addressed if I was involved in the project earlier. And I'm not going to try to muscle my way into a project, right? But if your colleagues are aware that there's an expert or someone who's done these types of projects beforehand, then having easier communication and I don't need to be an author on the paper. I'm totally glad giving advice at the beginning or at the end at any point. It's just, yeah, there is a timing to this if you want to do a high quality project. And I'm not a recovery expert. I can't resuscitate things. And usually when I provide ways to improve things, which is usually after a process of review where the reviewers ask for something, like I'm glad to help, but yeah, there's a way to ease the tension and pain for everybody if there's expertise pulled in at the front end rather than at the back end.
I think that's a really powerful point, isn't it? It's much easier to kind of design something properly and in line with best practices and do it than kind of realize that you missed something really important out and try and recover that, because it's just not going to happen. Certainly not as effectively as it would have done if it was identified early. Someone's actually just put a comment on YouTube, and I think it's quite a good one. They said, I think quality could be promoted by making it part of the themes in a conference and then put out a call for papers so that participants in a conference can see what a high quality evidence synthesis report looks like. That might be some feedback for ESMARConf 2024. Yeah, I think quality, having sort of quality appraisal of the reviews as part of a theme within a conference to make sure some really high quality syntheses can be showcased could be a really positive move going forward. Not just looking at the subject of the review, but how it's done, and use that as a core theme.
Yeah, but I could also see that turning sour where
Yeah.
where you're indirectly disparaging researchers because they weren't able to follow best practices, right? But maybe that goes into the shaming part.
And there are definitely challenges to following best practices, not least resourcing issues and timescales and availability of people. And I think whilst we can look at really high quality sort of evidence synthesis and ones that have followed best practices, that doesn't mean that ones that haven't been able to are necessarily completely worthless, for example. So we're coming up to 8 o'clock, and I think we've kind of reached a natural sort of end to the questions. So I've got no more questions on YouTube or Slack, but I'm sure if people are watching on catch up, they may well post some questions later, and we'll do our best to try and answer them as soon as possible. All that's left is for me to say a massive thank you to Sarah, Marc and Wolfgang for giving up their time today. It's been really interesting. I've been quite lucky getting to moderate this session, so just a massive thank you for giving up your time this evening, and also a thank you to everyone who's watching